On an isolated farm, a man carries the weight of a tragic past, living among fences, waste, and buried memories. But when a distant scream echoes through the forest, their lonely refuge is interrupted by a more desperate one and her baby, fleeing something dark. As the shadows of death draw closer, he is forced to revive ancient gases to confront a threat he cannot ignore. The ranch that once offered refuge becomes a battlefield where love and survival intertwine. Before listening to this exciting story, remember to subscribe to the channel. The wind blew strongly through the pines as Jack contemplated the horizon from his ranch's porch. Montana's mountains rose majestically before him, silent witnesses to his voluntary solitude. At his feet, Scout, his faithful German shepherd, dozed peacefully, oblivious to the thoughts crossing his master's mind. The Haven Ranch, as he had named it years ago, was a living testimony to his story. Every board on the porch, every repaired fence, every furrow in the earth bore the imprint of his tireless work. After the accident that took Mary, his wife, and their 2 children, Jack had found in this secluded corner of the world the only place where the pain became more bearable. The morning began like any other. Jack rose at dawn, made coffee in his old enameled coffee pot, and went out to feed the animals. The corral needed repairs, and the chickens demanded constant attention. Scout followed him faithfully, his constant presence the only dialogue Jack needed in his days. However, that October afternoon, something changed. The sky was beginning to turn orange when Scout suddenly perked up his ears and began to growl. Jack knew his dog well. He wasn't a nervous animal nor prone to getting upset without reason. Something had disturbed his tranquility. "What's wrong, boy?" asked Jack, watching as Scout headed toward the path leading to the caves in the east. The dog stopped, looked at his master, and barked urgently, a sound that echoed off the rocky canyon walls. Jack took his flashlight and rifle, more out of habit than necessity, and followed Scout. The dog moved forward with determination, occasionally stopping to ensure his master was following. The vegetation grew denser as they ventured into the ranch's less traveled territory. The sun was beginning to set when they reached the entrance of a cave that Jack vaguely knew. Scout stopped abruptly, his barks now more intense and frequent. That's when Jack heard it, a weak baby's cry. His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't heard a child's cry in years, and the sound sent a shiver down his spine. He cautiously advanced toward the cave entrance, lighting the way with his flashlight. What he found paralyzed him. Huddled against the rocky wall, a young woman held a baby to her chest. Her face was marked by exhaustion and fear, and her clothes, though of good quality, showed signs of several days of continuous wear. "Please," whispered the woman, her voice barely audible, "don't hurt us." Jack immediately lowered his rifle and set it on the ground, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not going to hurt you," he responded softly, trying not to frighten her more. "My name is Jack, this is my ranch." Scout continued barking, but now his barks were directed toward the outside of the cave. Jack directed his flashlight beam where his dog was pointing, and his heart skipped another beat. Less than 50 yards away, a grizzly bear was sniffing the air, clearly attracted by the human presence. "Don't move," Jack whispered to the woman, who upon seeing the bear clutched her baby even tighter to her chest. "Scout, stay," he ordered his dog, who immediately obeyed, though maintaining a low, constant growl. Jack knew they had to act quickly. The bear wouldn't take long to come closer, and the situation could become dangerous in seconds. With calculated movements, he took the lighter from his pocket and began searching for dry branches near the cave entrance. "What's your name?" he asked the woman while working, trying to keep her calm. "Sarah," she responded, gently rocking her baby who had begun to stir. "And this is Emma." Jack managed to gather enough branches and with precise movements created a small fire at the cave entrance. The fire, combined with Scout's barking, who had resumed his vocal guard, began to take effect. The bear, after several minutes of tension, finally retreated, disappearing into the vegetation. Only then did Jack allow himself to breathe deeply. He turned to Sarah and noticed she was trembling, both from cold and fear. "You can't stay here," he said firmly but kindly. "My ranch is about 20 minutes away. You have to come with me." Sarah hesitated for a moment, her dark eyes studying Jack's face. There was something in her gaze, a mixture of desperation and determination, that told Jack this woman was running from something more dangerous than a bear. "Can you walk?" he asked, noticing for the first time that Sarah had an injury to her ankle. She nodded, though her grimace of pain when trying to stand contradicted her response. Jack approached cautiously, respecting her space. "Let me help you," he offered, extending his hand. After a moment of hesitation, Sarah accepted his help. Jack helped her up while she firmly held Emma. Scout, as if understanding the gravity of the situation, stayed close, alternating his attention between the path ahead and the group he was protecting. The return to the ranch was slow and careful. Darkness had fallen completely, and only the moonlight and Jack's flashlight illuminated their way. Throughout the journey, Sarah didn't let go of her daughter for even a moment, and Jack noticed how her eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, as if expecting some danger to emerge from the shadows at any moment. When they finally reached the ranch, Jack could clearly see the exhaustion on Sarah's face. He helped her sit in one of the porch chairs while he quickly went inside to prepare a room for her and her daughter. That night, while listening to Sarah's soft footsteps in the guest room and Emma's occasional coos, Jack sat in his rocking chair on the porch with Scout at his feet. The ranch, which for so long had been a refuge of solitude, now housed new voices, new sounds. And as he contemplated the stars, Jack couldn't help but wonder what story these unexpected visitors were hiding and why fate had brought them to his door. Dawn arrived with a soft mist that covered the ranch like a protective blanket. Jack, accustomed to his solitary routines, found himself preparing breakfast for three for the first time in years. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and scrambled eggs filled the kitchen when he heard Sarah's soft footsteps. "Good morning," she said, holding Emma, who was observing everything with her large, curious eyes. The morning light revealed Sarah's condition better. Her face showed signs of exhaustion, and her ankle was visibly swollen. "Sit down," Jack indicated, pointing to a chair at the kitchen table. "I need to check that wound." Sarah sat cautiously while Emma played with a lock of her mother's hair. Jack took out the first aid kit he kept in the pantry, a reminder of the years when his wife Mary insisted on keeping the house prepared for any emergency. "How did you get here?" Jack asked as he carefully cleaned the wound. He noticed Sarah tensing at the question. It's a long story," she replied, averting her gaze. "I can only tell you that we needed to escape." Jack nodded, not pressing further. In his years of solitude, he had learned that everyone keeps their secrets for a reason. As he bandaged her ankle, he observed that Sarah was wearing a wedding ring, but she nervously twisted it on her finger, as if it were more of a chain than a symbol of love. Scout entered the kitchen, wagging his tail at the sight of the visitors. To Jack's surprise, the dog gently approached Emma, who let out a giggle and extended her small hands towards him. "You have a very special dog," Sarah commented, smiling for the first time since her arrival. "Scout has a gift for judging people," Jack replied, finishing the bandage. "And it seems he likes you both." Breakfast passed in comfortable silence, interrupted only by Emma's occasional gurgles and the sounds of cutlery. Jack noticed that Sarah ate like someone who hasn't had a decent meal in days, though she tried to maintain her composure. "You can stay as long as you need," Jack finally said as he collected the plates. "The nearest town is a 2-hour drive, but you'll be safe here." Sarah's eyes filled with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered, "but I don't want to cause you any trouble." "The only troubles I have are with broken fences and stubborn chickens," Jack replied with a slight smile. "And speaking of which, I have work to do." Over the next few days, a routine began to establish itself at the ranch. Jack continued with his daily tasks, while Sarah, once her ankle began to improve, insisted on helping with household chores. Emma spent the mornings in an improvised crib made from a padded wooden box, alternately watched over by Scout, who had assumed the role of dedicated guardian. However, Jack couldn't ignore the signs. He noticed how Sarah startled at sudden noises, how she constantly checked the windows, how her eyes filled with terror when she heard vehicle engines in the distance. At night, he sometimes heard her crying quietly in her room. One afternoon, while Jack was repairing a fence, Sarah approached with Emma in her arms. She sat on a nearby log, silently observing his work for a moment. "My husband," she began, her voice barely audible over the sound of the hammer. "He's not a good man." Jack stopped working and sat beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. Scout, who was never far, came closer and rested his head on Sarah's knees. At first he was different, she continued, absently stroking Scout's ears. Or maybe I was too young to see the signs. When I got pregnant with Emma, I thought things would improve, but... Her voice broke. Jack waited patiently, giving her the space to continue if she wished. It started with small things. Control over my phone, my friendships, my clothes. Then came the shouting, the threats. After Emma was born, the first time he hit me, I knew we had to leave. Jack tightened his grip on the hammer, feeling an anger he hadn't experienced in years. Does he know where you are? Sarah shook her head. I escaped one night while he was sleeping. I took some money I had been secretly saving and some important documents. We traveled by bus for days, constantly changing routes. But he has contacts, money, influence. When we reached these mountains, the money had run out. And then that bear appeared. You're safe here, Jack affirmed firmly. No one will find you in this corner of the world. But even as he spoke those words, Jack knew it wouldn't be that simple. Old Tom, the nearest neighbor, was known for his curiosity and tendency to spread gossip in town. Jack had already seen him lurking closer to the ranch than usual in recent days. That night, after Sarah and Emma had retired to sleep, Jack stayed on the porch smoking a cigarette while contemplating the stars. Scout rested at his feet, but his ears moved constantly, alert to any unusual sound. The ranch had been his escape from the world, his way of distancing himself from pain and memories. Now, ironically, it had become a refuge for someone else fleeing from their own demons. Jack extinguished the cigarette and looked towards the window of the room where Sarah and Emma slept. He had lost his own family tragically, but fate, in its mysterious wisdom, had sent him two souls who needed protection. And Jack was determined not to fail them. What he didn't know was that the coming weeks would test that determination in ways he could never have imagined. News of a woman and baby's presence at Jack's ranch spread through the town like wildfire. Old Tom, with his characteristic worn-out hat and old red pickup truck, began to appear more frequently around the ranch, always with some transparent excuse. "Jack," he called one morning from the main fence, "I came to see if you need any help with the cattle." Jack, who in 15 years had never needed or asked for help from anyone, recognized the intention behind the offer. "Everything's fine, old Tom. Thanks for asking." But the old man didn't give up. "You know, people in town are talking. A young woman alone with a child. It's not common in these parts." "People should mind their own business," Jack replied dryly, while Scout growled softly beside him. From the kitchen window, Sarah watched the scene with concern. Emma was playing on the floor with some empty thread spools Jack had found in a drawer, oblivious to the growing tension around her. That afternoon, while Jack was repairing the barn roof, Sarah approached with 2 glasses of lemonade. "Maybe we should leave," she said quietly. "I don't want to cause you trouble with the neighbors." Jack came down from the ladder and took one of the glasses. "The only troubles are the ones people create in their heads. This is your home now if you want it to be." The word home made Sarah catch her breath for a moment. It had been so long since she felt she belonged anywhere. The following days brought a more established routine. Sarah had proven to have a talent for cooking, and the aromas coming from the kitchen reminded Jack of the times when his house was full of life. In the afternoons, while Jack worked in the field, she would sit on the porch with Emma, singing lullabies and watching Scout patrol the ranch surroundings. However, the peace was fragile. One afternoon, while Jack was in town buying supplies, he overheard fragments of conversations that chilled his blood. "They say she arrived at night, like a fugitive. What if she's running from the law? My cousin is a cop in Billings. Says there's a man looking for his wife and daughter." Jack hurried through his shopping and returned to the ranch as fast as he could. He found Sarah in the backyard, hanging laundry while Emma slept in her makeshift crib under the shade of a tree. "We need to be more careful," he warned her. "People in town are asking questions." Sarah's face paled. Has he been asking around here?" "Not directly, but rumors fly. We need a plan." That night, after putting Emma to bed, Sarah and Jack sat at the kitchen table, each with a cup of coffee. The kerosene lamp cast dancing shadows on the walls as they discussed their options. "I have some savings," Jack said. "We could get you new documents, a ticket to somewhere far away." Sarah shook her head. "I can't accept your money, Jack. You've already done too much for us." "Money means nothing if it can't help those who need it," he replied, remembering the words his father used to say. Suddenly, Scout began barking furiously outside. Jack jumped up, grabbing the shotgun he kept near the door. Sarah ran to the room where Emma was sleeping. In the darkness of the night, a figure was moving among the trees. Jack held the shotgun steady as he advanced towards the porch, with Scout at his side, growling menacingly. "Come out where I can see you," Jack shouted. The figure emerged from the shadows. It was old Tom. "Sorry to scare you," said the old man, raising his hands. "But I had to come warn you. Today in town, a man was asking questions, showing pictures." Jack's heart skipped a beat. From the window, he could see Sarah's terrified face as she held Emma tightly against her chest. "Old Tom," Jack said, lowering the gun but keeping it visible. "What did you tell that man?" The old man adjusted his hat, uncomfortable. "Nothing, Jack. I may be an old gossip, but I'm not a traitor. I told him I hadn't seen anyone around these mountains that matched that description." Jack felt a deep gratitude towards his neighbor. "Thank you, old Tom." "Don't thank me," the old man replied. "Just take good care of them, and if you need help, you know where to find me." After old Tom left, Jack went back inside. He found Sarah sitting on the bed, rocking Emma, who had woken up with the commotion. "He'll find us," she whispered, tears running down her cheeks. "He always finds us." Jack knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Not this time, Sarah. This time is different. This time you're not alone." Scout approached and rested his head on Sarah's lap, as if wanting to confirm his master's words. Outside, the full moon bathed the ranch in its silver light, while the wind whispered through the pines a promise of protection. But Jack knew the real test was just beginning. The circle was closing in, and soon they would have to face something more dangerous than town rumors or nighttime visits from concerned neighbors. The following days passed in a state of constant alertness. Jack reinforced the locks on doors and windows and began keeping Scout inside the house during the nights. The daily routine continued, but there was an underlying tension that could be felt in the air, like electricity before a storm. One morning, Emma woke up with a fever. Her small body burned as she cried inconsolably, and nothing Sarah did seemed to calm her. "She needs a doctor," Jack said, watching as Sarah tried to soothe the baby with damp cloths. "We can't go into town," Sarah responded, fear evident in her voice. "He could be there." "We can't let the child suffer out of fear," Jack insisted. "I've known Dr. Johnson for years. He's a good man, discreet." After an hour of debate and with Emma's fever rising, Sarah finally agreed. Jack prepared the old truck while she wrapped Emma in a blanket. Scout, against his usual habit, refused to stay at the ranch and jumped into the back of the truck. The trip to town was tense. Every passing vehicle, every person they saw on the road could be a threat. Sarah kept her head down, holding Emma against her chest, while Jack drove with his eyes alert to the road and the rearview mirrors. Dr. Johnson's office was on a side street in town. Jack parked at the back of the building and helped Sarah down. Scout followed them, glued to their heels. "Jack," the doctor greeted as they entered. He was an older man with grey hair and kind eyes behind his glasses. "What brings you here?" "The child has a fever, doctor," Jack explained. "Can you take a look at her?" Dr. Johnson examined Emma with professional care, while Sarah watched every movement anxiously. "It's an ear infection," he finally diagnosed. "Nothing serious, but she'll need antibiotics." As the doctor was writing the prescription, the bell on the front door chimed. Sarah visibly tensed, and Scout began to growl low. "Wait here," Jack whispered, stepping out into the hallway. In the waiting room, a tall, well-dressed man was talking to the receptionist. He was showing a photograph and asking questions in a low voice. Jack felt his heart skip a beat when he saw the receptionist pointing towards the hallway where they were. Acting quickly, Jack returned to the examination room. "We have to go, now." Dr. Johnson, catching the urgency in his voice, guided them towards a back door. "Take this," he said, handing them the prescription and a bottle of medicine. "And Jack, be careful." They exited through the back alley just as they heard footsteps approaching down the main hallway. Sarah, with Emma in her arms, ran towards the truck while Jack covered them. Scout jumped into the back, his posture tense and vigilant. "Sarah," a male voice resonated from the door of the clinic. "I know you're here!" Jack started the engine and accelerated, leaving town via secondary roads that only locals knew. In the passenger seat, Sarah trembled as she tried to keep calm for Emma's sake. "He found us," she whispered, tears running down her cheeks. I told you he'd find us. But he doesn't have you, Jack responded firmly. And he won't. The road back to the ranch was different from the one they usually took. Jack drove through rarely traveled paths, crossing streams and skirting hills. His knowledge of the terrain, acquired over years of solitude, now served to protect his passengers. When they finally reached the ranch, the sun was beginning to set. Jack helped Sarah down and quickly guided her into the house. Pack a bag, he instructed. Just the essentials, we can't stay here tonight. Where will we go? Sarah asked while administering the first dose of medicine to Emma. I have a cabin high up in the mountains, Jack replied as he collected provisions and ammunition. I built it years ago as a shelter for severe storms. No one else knows its location. As they packed what they needed, Scout remained on the porch, his eyes fixed on the ranch's access road. The wind had begun to blow harder, and dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. The storm will help us, Jack said, observing the sky. It'll erase our tracks. In less than an hour, they had loaded everything necessary into the truck. Jack took one last look at his ranch, the home he had built with his own hands. He didn't know when they would be able to return, or if they could at all. As the truck moved away along a path barely visible among the vegetation, the first raindrops began to fall. The approaching storm wasn't just meteorological, it was the prelude to a confrontation that everyone knew was inevitable. In the growing darkness, Jack gripped the steering wheel with determination. This time he wouldn't allow fate to snatch another family from him. The rain fell heavily as the truck ascended the winding mountain road. Jack drove with extreme caution, his eyes alternating between the muddy path and the rearview mirrors. Sarah had fallen asleep with Emma in her arms, the medicine finally taking effect. The cabin appeared like a shadow in the curtain of water, a solid structure of wood and stone, almost invisible among the vegetation. Jack had chosen its location well. From below it was practically impossible to detect. "Welcome to my other refuge," he said as he parked under a natural shelter formed by overhanging rocks. "It's not the ranch, but it'll keep us safe." The interior of the cabin was austere but cozy. A fireplace dominated the main room, and there were 2 small bedrooms in the back. Jack lit some oil lamps while Sarah laid Emma down in one of the beds. "I built this place after the accident," Jack explained as he lit the fire. "I needed a place where the world couldn't find me." Sarah sat close to the fire, hugging herself. "Can I ask what happened with your family?" Jack remained silent for a moment, stoking the flames. "It was 10 years ago. Mary, my wife, and our 2 children, Charlie and Anna, were coming back from town. The storm was strong, like this one. The bridge over the river." His voice broke slightly. "When I got there, it was too late. The river had taken them. They never found the bodies." Sarah reached out and took Jack's hand. "I'm so sorry." "That's why I understand," he continued. "I understand what it means to lose everything, and also what it means to want to protect what you love at any cost." Scout, who had been watching out the window, suddenly perked up his ears and growled softly. "What is it, boy?" Jack asked, moving closer to the window. Through the rain, they saw distant lights moving along the main mountain road. Someone was searching. "It's Richard," Sarah whispered, fear evident in her voice. "He knows these mountains. He used to hunt here before we got married." Jack turned off all the lamps except one in the room where Emma was sleeping. "He can't see us from there," he assured. "And the rain will erase any tracks we might have left." They sat in the darkness, listening to the rain pounding on the roof and the occasional thunder that shook the windows. Scout remained alert, moving between the windows like a silent sentinel. "I need to tell you something," Sarah said after a long silence. "About Richard, about why I really ran." Jack sat across from her, the faint firelight casting shadows on their faces. "Richard wasn't just violent with me," Sarah began. "He's part of something bigger, more dangerous. Influence peddling, money laundering. When I got pregnant with Emma, I thought he would change. But I started finding documents, overhearing conversations." "And you discovered something you shouldn't have," Jack completed. Sarah nodded. "Names, dates, places. It's all documented. I saved everything before I ran. It's my life insurance. And now also my death sentence." "Where are these documents?" Jack asked. "Hidden at the ranch," she replied. "In the lining of my old suitcase, the one I left under the bed." Jack stood up abruptly. "I have to go back." "No!" Sarah exclaimed, grabbing his arm. It's too dangerous. If he finds those documents, he'll know you have evidence against him. He won't stop until he finds you. A particularly loud thunderclap woke Emma, who began to cry. Sarah rushed to the bedroom while Jack stayed by the window, watching the distant lights still moving across the mountain. "I'll go at dawn," he finally decided. "The rain will have erased our tracks, and it'll be safer in daylight." They spent the night on watch, taking turns. Sarah cared for Emma, whose fever had dropped considerably, while Jack kept the fire burning and watched the surroundings with Scout. As dawn began to break through the clouds, the rain finally subsided. The lights on the mountain had disappeared, but they all knew that didn't mean the danger had passed. "I'll be back before noon," Jack promised as he prepared to leave. "Keep the doors locked and don't turn on any lights. Scout will stay with you." Sarah hugged him impulsively. "Please be careful." Jack nodded and stepped out into the damp morning. As he descended the path in the truck, he couldn't help but think about the irony of fate. He had fled to the mountains to escape the world, and now he found himself in the middle of a battle that wasn't his, but which had somehow become his reason to keep going. The ranch seemed untouched when Jack arrived, but something in the air told him he wasn't alone. Years of living in solitude had sharpened his senses, and now every fiber of his being screamed at him to be careful. He parked the truck behind the barn and approached the house stealthily. The front door was closed as they had left it, but the curtains in the living room were moving differently. Someone had been there. Cautiously, he entered through the back door of the kitchen. The interior of the house showed subtle signs of having been searched. Drawers slightly misaligned, objects moved a few millimeters from their usual position. He headed straight for Sarah's room. The old suitcase was still under the bed, apparently untouched. Jack carefully pulled it out and began examining the lining. "Looking for something in particular?" The voice froze him in place. In the doorway stood a tall man in an expensive suit with a cold gaze. "Richard." "This is private property," Jack responded, slowly standing up. "Where are my wife and daughter?" Richard asked, his voice deceptively calm. "I don't know who you're talking about." Richard smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Come on, Jack. May I call you Jack? I know all about you. The lonely rancher, the widower who lost his family. Touching, really. But now you're involved in something you don't understand." "I understand more than you think," Jack replied, his hand moving imperceptibly towards the knife on his belt. "Really? Do you understand that you're protecting a woman who stole confidential documents? That she's putting operations beyond your comprehension at risk? I understand that a woman and her daughter fled from you out of fear," Jack countered. "That's all I need to know." Richard took a step forward. "Look, let's make this simple. Tell me where they are, give me the documents, and you can go back to your quiet life. There might even be generous compensation for your discretion." "Like the one you offered old Tom?" Jack asked, noticing a flash of surprise in Richard's eyes. "The old man was smarter than you. He took the money but still told me he didn't know anything. You, on the other hand, are risking everything for a woman you barely know." Jack thought of Sarah and Emma, how they had brought life back to his ranch, the trust in their eyes when she told him her story. "You're wrong," he said. "I'm not risking everything. I'm protecting everything that matters." The movement was quick. Richard pulled out a gun, but Jack had already anticipated the action. He lunged forward, striking the armed hand with the knife. The gun fell to the floor as the two men engaged in a hand-to-hand struggle. Richard was younger and in better shape, but Jack had the strength that comes from years of hard work and the determination of someone who has nothing to lose. They rolled on the floor, hitting furniture and walls. In the midst of the fight, Jack managed to reach the suitcase and tear the lining. An envelope fell to the floor, scattering documents and photographs. Richard lunged for them, but Jack intercepted him with a solid punch to the jaw. The sound of an engine outside distracted them both. Through the window, Jack saw old Tom's truck approaching the ranch, and behind it, a police patrol car. Richard took advantage of the distraction to recover his gun, but Jack was faster. With a kick, he sent the weapon sliding under the bed. "It's over," a voice shouted from outside. "The house is surrounded." Richard looked out the window and then at the documents scattered on the floor. His face contorted in a grimace of fury. "This isn't over," he hissed before running towards the back door. Jack didn't pursue him. Instead, he quickly gathered the documents and walked out the front door with his hands up. "Old Tom," he called, I need your help. The old man got out of his truck as two police officers approached with their weapons drawn. I told them something wasn't right, Old Tom explained. When I saw that man prowling around at night, I knew I had to do something. Jack handed the documents to the senior officer. These are the reasons why a woman and her daughter are running. I think you'll find some very interesting information here. As the officers reviewed the papers, their expressions changed from skepticism to grave concern. We need to put the lady and her daughter under protection, the officer finally said. Where are they? Jack looked towards the mountains. In a safe place. But first, I need your word that they'll be protected. The officer nodded solemnly. You have my word. These documents, and this goes beyond a domestic violence case. There are names here that, well, let's just say some important people will be very interested in this. As the afternoon sun descended over the mountains, Jack, accompanied by a police patrol, ascended towards the cabin. His heart pounded as he thought about how to explain everything that had happened to Sarah. Upon arrival, he found Scout on alert in front of the door. The dog relaxed upon recognizing his master, but kept a watchful eye on the officers. Jack, Sarah exclaimed as she saw him enter. She stopped short when she noticed the police. What? It's okay, Jack reassured her. Old Tom helped us. The documents are safe, and Richard, Ma'am, the senior officer intervened. Your husband is being sought. The documents we found reveal a corruption network involving high-level officials. We need to place you and your daughter under witness protection. Sarah sank into a chair, holding Emma tighter. So, it's over? Not entirely, the officer replied honestly. But now you have the power of the law on your side. Your testimony, along with those documents, could dismantle one of the largest corruption networks in the state. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. The officers established a security perimeter around the cabin while necessary arrangements were made. Sarah had to give a preliminary statement, reliving painful moments but strengthened by Jack's presence at her side. You'll have to leave tonight, the officer explained. We'll take you to a safe place until this is all resolved. Jack felt a knot in his throat. He had barely known Sarah and Emma, but the idea of seeing them leave caused him familiar pain. Can we talk for a moment? Sarah asked Jack, leading him aside. They sat on the cabin's porch as the sun set behind the mountains. Scout lay at their feet, as always, protective and loyal. I don't know how to thank you, Sarah began, her eyes bright with unshed tears. You saved our lives. You saved mine, Jack replied softly. This ranch, these mountains, it was my escape from the world, my way of hiding from pain. But you reminded me that there are things worth fighting for. Emma, half asleep in her mother's arms, reached out her small hand towards Jack, who took it tenderly. Will we see you again? Sarah asked. The witness protection program is very strict, the officer interrupted, who had approached. For your safety, you'll have to maintain a low profile for a while. Jack nodded, understanding. The ranch will always be your home, he said. When all this is over... Ma'am, another officer called. It's time. The next moments passed as if in slow motion. Sarah hugged Jack tightly, while Emma clung to his neck. Scout whimpered softly, as if understanding that a farewell was approaching. Take good care of them, Jack told the officer as he helped Sarah into the police vehicle. We will, the officer promised. And Jack, thank you for doing the right thing. As the vehicle drove away down the mountain path, Jack remained on the cabin's porch with Scout by his side. The sun had completely disappeared, leaving only a purple glow on the horizon. Old Tom, who had remained discreetly in the background, approached. You did a good thing, Jack, the old man said. Mary would be proud. Jack felt his eyes moisten at the mention of his wife's name. You know, Old Tom, for the first time in years, I think you're right. That night, back at his ranch, Jack sat in his porch rocking chair, as he had done so many nights before. But something had changed. The silence was no longer a refuge, but a reminder of the voices that had filled his house during those brief but meaningful weeks. Scout rested his head on Jack's knee, emitting a soft whine. I know, boy, Jack whispered, scratching the dog's ears. I miss them too. The months that followed passed with an almost painful slowness for Jack. The ranch, which had once been his refuge, now seemed too big, too quiet. Every corner held a memory of Sarah and Emma, the improvised crib in the living room, Emma's drawings stuck on the refrigerator, the lingering scent of Sarah's perfume on the curtains. The investigation into the corruption network progressed, and occasionally old Tom brought him news from town. Important names appeared in the newspapers. Politicians resigned, businessmen were arrested. But of Richard, Sarah's husband, nothing was known. He had disappeared, as if the earth had swallowed him. One spring morning, as Jack was repairing a fence, he saw old Tom's truck approaching on the dusty road. "Jack," called the old man, getting down from the vehicle with difficulty, "you have visitors." Behind old Tom, a man in a suit got out of the passenger seat. Jack recognized him as one of the officers who had been at the cabin that night. "Mr. Hernandez," the officer greeted, extending his hand. "I have news that might interest you." They sat on the porch where so many important conversations had taken place. Scout rested at Jack's feet, his eyes fixed on the newcomer. "Richard has been captured," the officer announced without preamble. "He was trying to cross the border with false documents. With his arrest, we believe most of the network has been dismantled." Jack felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "And Sarah? Emma?" The officer smiled slightly. "They're safe. In fact, that's the other reason for my visit. The Witness Protection Program considers that they are no longer in immediate danger. They can return if they wish." Jack's heart skipped a beat. "Return? Here? That's their decision," the officer replied, "but we thought you should know." After the officer left, Jack remained seated on the porch, processing the information. Old Tom, who had remained silent during the conversation, finally spoke. "What are you going to do, Jack?" Jack looked towards the mountains, where he had found Sarah and Emma that stormy night. "I don't know, old Tom. Months have passed. Maybe they found a new home, a new life." The old man stood up with difficulty. "You know, Jack, sometimes life gives us second chances. We're not always wise enough to take them." The following days were a mix of anxiety and hope for Jack. He cleaned the house from top to bottom, fixed that loose porch step that had always been wobbly, even planted flowers in the front yard. A week after the officer's announcement, Jack was in the barn when Scout began barking enthusiastically. He rushed out, his heart pounding. A taxi was approaching on the ranch road, raising a cloud of dust in its wake. It stopped in front of the house, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. The back door opened and Sarah emerged, with Emma in her arms. The child had grown, and her dark hair now formed small curls. Sarah looked different too. There was a new confidence in her posture, a serenity in her gaze. "Jack," she called softly. He advanced slowly, almost fearing it was a dream. Scout ran towards them, barking and wagging his tail frenetically. "Hello, Scout," Emma laughed, extending her small hands towards the dog. I wasn't sure if you'd come back," Jack said, his voice hoarse with emotion. Sarah took a step forward. "How could we not? This is our home." "Is it?" Jack asked, hope evident in his voice. "If you want it to be," she replied, her eyes searching his. Jack extended his arms, and Sarah approached, allowing him to envelop her and Emma in an embrace. Scout jumped around them, barking with joy. "Welcome home," Jack whispered, feeling that for the first time in years, his heart was complete. The days at the ranch took on a new rhythm, filled with life and purpose. Jack, who had lived in a solitary routine for years, now found himself waking to the sound of Emma's laughter and the aroma of coffee that Sarah prepared every morning. The adaptation wasn't easy. Sarah, accustomed to city life, had to learn the tasks of the ranch. Jack, for his part, rediscovered what it meant to share his space and his life with others. One morning, as they were repairing the corral fence together, Sarah broke the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing by coming back," she said, hammering a post with more force than necessary. Jack looked at her, surprised. "Do you regret it?" Sarah shook her head. "It's not that. It's just that I fear I've interrupted your life. This was your refuge, your space." Jack put down his tools and approached her. "Sarah, before you arrived, this wasn't a refuge. It was a prison I had built for myself. You and Emma, you gave meaning back to this place." She looked at him, her eyes shining. "Do you really feel that way?" "Every day," he replied, taking her hand. The sound of Emma calling Scout broke the moment. The girl was running through the field, chased by the faithful dog that seemed to have rejuvenated since their arrival. "Mom! Jack!" Emma shouted, approaching with something in her hands. "Look what I found!" In her small palms rested a fallen nest with 3 intact eggs inside. "Oh, honey," said Sarah, kneeling beside her daughter, "we should return it to its tree." Jack watched as mother and daughter searched for the right tree, with Scout following them closely. Something stirred in his chest as he saw Sarah lift Emma so she could place the nest back on a safe branch. That night, after putting Emma to bed, Sarah found Jack on the porch contemplating the stars. "She adores you, you know," said Sarah, sitting next to him. Jack smiled. "She's an incredible girl, so brave and curious." "Like her mother," Sarah joked. "Like her mother," Jack confirmed, his tone more serious. They looked at each other in silence for a moment, the unspoken words floating between them. "Jack," Sarah began, "I know this isn't conventional, that we came into your life in an unexpected way. But I want you to know that for me, for Emma, you are family," Jack completed. "You are my family now." Sarah nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Are you sure this is what you want? A woman with a complicated past and a little girl?" Jack took her hand. "What I want is to wake up every morning and hear Emma's laughter. I want to teach her to ride a horse and recognize constellations. I want to share coffee with you on this porch and watch the sun set over the mountains. I want this, Sarah. I want you." They kissed under the starry sky, a kiss full of promises and new beginnings. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The ranch flourished with the renewed energy of its inhabitants. Jack taught Emma to care for the animals, while Sarah discovered an unexpected talent for gardening, transforming the backyard into an oasis of colors and scents. One afternoon, as Jack was teaching Emma to ride the old ranch horse, Scout began to bark, announcing the arrival of a visitor. Old Tom was approaching in his truck, accompanied by the officer who had given them the news of Richard's capture. "Jack," the officer greeted, getting out of the vehicle. "Mrs. Sarah, I have important news." Sarah tensed visibly, while Jack instinctively moved closer to her and Emma. "Richard's trial has concluded," the officer announced. "With the evidence provided and your testimony, he's been sentenced to 20 years in prison." A wave of relief washed over Sarah's face. "So, it's really over," the officer nodded. "The corruption network has been dismantled. You're no longer under witness protection. You're free to live your life as you choose." Emma, who had been listening attentively, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Does this mean we can stay here forever, Mum?" Sarah looked at Jack, a question in her eyes. He smiled and nodded. "Yes, sweetheart," Sarah replied, hugging her daughter. "This is our home now." Old Tom, who had remained silent, cleared his throat. "Well, I think this calls for a celebration. What do you say we organize a barbecue this weekend? The whole town would love to properly meet the newcomers." Jack looked at Sarah, who nodded with a smile. "That sounds wonderful, Old Tom," he said. As the officer and Old Tom prepared to leave, Emma ran to Scout, hugging the dog tightly. "Did you hear that, Scout? We're staying." That night, after Emma had gone to bed, Jack and Sarah sat on the porch swing, a blanket draped over their laps. The stars shone brightly in the clear mountain sky. "You know," Jack said, breaking the comfortable silence, "when I lost Mary and the kids, I thought my life was over. I came to this ranch to hide from the world, to forget." Sarah squeezed his hand, encouraging him to continue. "But now I realize that life had other plans. It brought me you and Emma. It gave me a second chance at happiness, at family." Sarah rested her head on his shoulder. "When I ran away with Emma, I was terrified. I didn't know if we'd survive, let alone find a place to call home. But here, with you, I feel safe for the first time in years." Jack turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Sarah, I know we came together in unusual circumstances, but I can't imagine my life without you and Emma now. I love you both, and I want to make this official. Will you marry me?" Sarah's eyes welled up with tears, but her smile was radiant. "Yes, Jack. Yes, I will marry you." They sealed their promise with a kiss, as Scout, ever vigilant, watched from his spot by the door. The ranch, once a symbol of Jack's isolation, had transformed into a haven of love and new beginnings. As they sat there, planning their future together, Both Jack and Sarah knew that the best chapters of their lives were yet to be written. The day of the wedding dawned clear and bright, a perfect Montana summer morning. The ranch was bustling with activity as neighbors and friends arrived to help with the final preparations. Jack stood in his old bedroom, adjusting his tie in front of the mirror. The room, once a sanctuary of solitude, now held memories of laughter and love. Scout lay on the bed, watching his master with curious eyes. "What do you think, boy?" Jack asked, turning to face the dog. "Do I look ready to start a new life?" Scout barked once, as if in approval, causing Jack to chuckle. A knock on the door interrupted the moment. Old Tom peeked in, his weathered face beaming with joy. "It's time, Jack," he said. "Everyone's waiting." The backyard had been transformed into a picturesque wedding venue. Rows of chairs faced an arch adorned with wildflowers, the majestic mountains serving as a breathtaking backdrop. Guests from town mingled with Sarah's friends who had traveled for the occasion, creating a warm and joyful atmosphere. As Jack took his place under the arch, his eyes scanned the crowd. He saw faces that had become familiar over the past year. The kind doctor who had treated Emma, the officer who had brought them the news of their freedom, and many others who had become part of their extended family. The soft strains of music announced the bride's arrival. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he saw Sarah walking down the aisle, radiant in a simple white dress. Emma preceded her, scattering flower petals and grinning widely at Jack. As Sarah reached him, Jack took her hands in his, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought them to this moment. The ceremony was simple, yet profound. They exchanged vows that spoke of second chances, of love born from adversity, and of the family they had created together. "I, Jack, take you, Sarah, to be my wife," he said, his voice steady and full of emotion. "I promise to stand by you and Emma, to protect and cherish you both for all the days of my life." Sarah's eyes glistened with tears as she responded, "I, Sarah, take you, Jack, to be my husband. I promise to fill our home with love and laughter, to be your partner in all things, and to cherish the family we've built together." As they sealed their vows with a kiss, the gathered crowd erupted in cheers. Scout, who had been sitting patiently beside Emma, let out a joyful bark. The reception that followed was a true Montana celebration. Tables laden with home-cooked food, music floating through the air, and laughter echoing across the ranch. Jack and Sarah moved among their guests, their happiness infectious. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the mountains, Jack found a quiet moment with his new family. Emma was dozing in Sarah's arms, tired from all the excitement. "How does it feel to be Mrs. Hernandez?" Jack asked, wrapping an arm around Sarah's waist. She leaned into him, a contented smile on her face. "It feels like coming home." They stood there, watching as the sky transformed into a canvas of pinks and purples. Scout lay at their feet, ever the faithful guardian. "You know," Jack said softly, "when I first came to this ranch, I thought I was escaping the world. But now I realize I was just waiting for you, for Emma, for this moment." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes full of love. "And we were out there, searching for a safe haven. Who would have thought we'd find it here, with you?" Emma stirred in Sarah's arms, blinking sleepily. "Are we a real family now?" she asked. Jack knelt down to her level, gently stroking her hair. "We've always been a real family, sweetheart. Today just made it official." As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains, Jack looked at the ranch house. It stood strong and welcoming, no longer a symbol of his past isolation, but a beacon of their shared future. The sound of laughter and music drifted from the reception, a reminder of the community that had embraced them. Jack realized that in opening his heart and his home, he had gained so much more than he ever thought possible. With Sarah's hand in his and Emma between them, Jack felt a sense of completion he had thought lost forever. The journey had been long and often difficult, but standing here surrounded by love, he knew that every step had been worth it. As they turned to rejoin their guests, Jack knew that while this chapter of their story was ending, the most beautiful pages were yet to be written. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, their love and their family stronger for having been forged in adversity. The ranch, once a refuge from the world, had become a sanctuary of love, hope, and new beginnings. And as the stars began to twinkle in the vast Montana sky, Jack, Sarah, and Emma stepped forward into their future, ready to write the next chapters of their life together.